General Vhorruk Kae had conquered 41 worlds, and not one of them had ever made him laugh. The 42nd was going to be Earth, and Earth had already begun. He stood on the observation deck of the dreadnought Unbending, a vessel so large it distorted the light of the star it orbited, and he studied the little blue planet with the expression of a butcher appraising a lamb. His aides called it a Deathworld. The reports called it a Deathworld. Vhorruk had read every report, cross-referenced every atmospheric survey, and personally reviewed the gravitational index no fewer than 3 times, and every time he had come to the same conclusion, and every time the conclusion had made the corners of his jaw plates twitch upward in the Keeser equivalent of a smirk. 1G, he said aloud, to no one in particular, because the deck had emptied of everyone who did not absolutely need to be there. His subordinates had learned that when the general spoke to no one, it was safest to be no one. 9.81 meters per second squared. The humans call this a Deathworld. Behind him, his intelligence officer, a lean and cautious Keeser named Sethalun, made the small clicking sound that in their species stood in for a nervous cough. The designation is theirs, General, not ours. They classify their homeworld as a Category 9 survival environment. Category 9, Vhorruk turned. He was enormous even by the standards of his people, 4 broad limbs of armored muscle and a spine that arched like a war standard, and when he turned, the whole deck seemed to tilt toward him out of instinct. Do you know what a Category 9 environment is on Keeser Prime, Sethalun? I do not have that figure to hand, General. 2.6 standard gravities, storms that flay the flesh from bone, oceans of liquid metal. That is a Category 6 on our scale. A Category 9 on Keeser Prime does not have a survey team because we do not send survey teams to Category 9s. We send weapons. He gestured at the blue planet with one enormous hand dismissively, the way a man might wave off a fly. And these creatures. These soft, wet, 2-limbed creatures, they crawl out of a puddle of 1G. They build their little cities on ground that would not bruise a hatchling, and they hand us a report that says, in their own words, Deathworld. As though the word means something, as though they have earned it. Sethalun said nothing. He had served under Vhorruk for 11 cycles, and he had learned that the general's contempt, once uncorked, needed to breathe before it could be corrected. Sometimes it could not be corrected at all. Sometimes it simply had to be poured out and left to evaporate, and the wise officer stood well back from the spill. I have fought real Deathworlds, Vhorruk went on, quieter now, which was worse. I have marched infantry across the salt glass of Tehran under 3 gravities of pressure, while the enemy dropped kinetic rain on our heads. I have watched my own soldiers, my own kin, fold like paper under a load that these earth things would call a pleasant afternoon. And now the Concordance sends me here, to this puddle, to negotiate. Negotiate. As though there is anything to negotiate with a species whose greatest physical achievement is standing upright without a support frame. The war was not technically a war yet. That was the delicate part. The Keeser Concordance had encountered humanity along the ragged edge of the Veil Reach 8 years earlier, and in those 8 years the 2 powers had circled each other the way 2 large predators circle a single kill, all posture and low sound and the careful measuring of teeth. There had been skirmishes. There had been the incident at the Perrault Relay, which both sides described very differently. And there had been, above all, an enormous and mutual failure to take each other seriously, which is the most dangerous thing that can exist between 2 peoples who each command the ability to end the other. The Concordance believed the humans were physically negligible. This was, in a narrow and misleading sense, true. A human standing on a Keeser world was a pitiable thing, gasping, sagging, crushed to the floor within minutes. Every joint military assessment had noted it. Every strategist had built their plans around it. Humanity fought from behind walls and inside machines and across distances, because humanity, the assessments agreed, could not stand up straight on a real battlefield. And the humans, for their part, believed the Kisur were slow. Enormous and terrible and slow, bound to their heavy worlds and their heavy bodies, magnificent in a fixed fight and hopeless in a moving one. There was truth in that too. There is always some truth in contempt. That is what makes it so easy to keep. Vhorruk had been chosen to lead the Earth mission precisely because he embodied the Concordance's view so completely. He did not merely believe the humans were weak. He required them to be weak. His entire understanding of the universe rested on the principle that strength was a thing you were born into, forged by the pressure of the world beneath you, and that a creature raised in a puddle could not be anything but a puddle creature, no matter how many cities it built or ships it launched. To suggest otherwise would have been to suggest that his own strength, the strength he had bled and marched and buried his kin to earn, might be available to a soft thing from a soft place, for free, by some accident of biology. He would not have that. No one who has suffered for a thing wants to be told the thing was cheap. "Where do they wish to hold the summit?" he asked. Sethalun checked his slate. "A neutral colony, Vale's descent. It sits at the boundary of both spheres. Neither of us claims it, which is why they proposed it. It is, he paused. "General, you should be aware of the local conditions." "What conditions?" "Vale's descent is a human colony, but it is not an Earth-standard human colony." Sethalun's clicking cough came again, longer this time. "It is a high-gravity settlement. The humans established it 2 generations ago on a captured superterrestrial world. The surface gravity is 2.9 standard Gs." Vhorruk went very still. In the Kisur, stillness could mean a great many things, and most of them were not peaceful. 2.9, he repeated. "Yes, General." "Higher than Kisur Prime." "Considerably higher, General. It is, by our own classification, a genuine hostile gravity world. Our doctrine would not permit ground operations there without full exoskeletal support and rotational deployment to prevent structural fatigue. The humans, however—" Sethalun hesitated over the words as though they might bite him. "The humans live there, permanently, without frames. They have for 2 generations." There was a long silence on the observation deck. Down below, the blue planet turned, oblivious, a soft thing in a soft orbit, and Vhorruk stared at it, and something moved behind his eyes that he did not let reach his face. "That is not possible," he said, "for the creatures described in these reports." "The reports concern Earth-standard humans, General. The colonists of Vale's descent are a distinct population. They have adapted. Their skeletal density, their muscular attachment, their cardiovascular pressure. Our medical intelligence flagged them as an anomaly some cycles ago, but the flag was, it was deprioritized." "Deprioritized by whom?" Sethalun did not answer, which was an answer. The flag had been deprioritized because a report describing weak, soft, negligible humans made the war plans work, and a report describing humans who could outlive a Kisur battlefield did not make the war plans work, and there is a kind of institution that always chooses the report that lets the plan proceed. Vhorruk knew this. He had built his career inside such an institution. He had more than once been the man who chose the convenient report. He turned back to the window. When he spoke again, his voice had recovered its certainty. And this is the thing to understand about General Vhorruk Kae, the thing that would matter more than his ships or his cannons or his 41 conquered worlds. He was not a stupid creature. He was a proud one. And pride is not the absence of intelligence. Pride is intelligence pressed into the service of a conclusion already reached. He had heard the fact 2.9 Gs, human colonists, no frames, and a stupider being might have been frightened by it. But Vhorruk was not frightened. He simply rebuilt the fact until it fit the shape of what he already knew. "Adapted," he said. "Bred, yes, I have seen this before. You take a soft thing and you subject its descendants to pressure, and after enough generations you get a thing that is somewhat less soft. It is not strength, Sethalun. It is compensation. A crutch grows thicker, it does not become a leg." He nodded slowly, pleased with the image. These colonists are not warriors. They are a stunted, thick-boned peasantry, clinging to a rock too heavy for them, and they have survived it the way a fungus survives, by lowering their ambitions until survival is all that is left. That is not what we are. We did not adapt to our worlds. We conquered them. Sethalun, who privately thought this distinction was doing an enormous amount of work, said only, "As you say, General. Set course for Vale's descent. I will attend this summit. I will stand on their heavy little world in my own body without a frame before their delegation, and I will let them watch me stand." Vhorruk's jaw plates lifted again into that terrible smirk. Let the peasants see what a real strength looks like. Let them measure themselves against it. It will do the negotiation good, to begin with a lesson in humility. He did not know, as he gave the order, that the lesson he was about to receive would be delivered by a 16-year-old girl who had never in her life thought of herself as strong, because on Vale's descent, being able to lift things was not a talent. It was just Tuesday. Her name was Priya Anand, and on the morning General Vhorruk Kae's fleet entered orbit above her world, she was late for school and arguing with a door. The door was not being difficult on purpose. Doors on Vale's descent were simply heavy, because everything on Vale's descent was heavy, because the world pulled at 3 times the strength that the ancestral human body had been built for, and so the colonists built everything squat and thick and reinforced and slow. Their houses were bunkers. Their vehicles crawled. Their birds, the few imported species that had survived, did not fly so much as launch themselves in short, furious, exhausting arcs and then land, panting, to reconsider. Everything on Vale's descent that wished to leave the ground had to fight for it, and everything that stayed on the ground did so with a grim, muscular determination that the colonists no longer even noticed in themselves. Priya noticed the door only because it had jammed on its runner, and she was late, and she had no patience for it. She was small for her age, most descent-born were, compact and dense, built low to the pull with dark eyes and a scowl she had inherited from her grandmother and a school satchel that weighed, by Earth standard measure, as much as a full-grown human, and which she carried on one shoulder without thinking about it, because to think about it would have been like thinking about breathing. She hooked 2 fingers under the edge of the jammed door, set her feet, and lifted. The door was a slab of composite and ceramic massing 300 kilograms, and it came up off its bent runner with a shriek of metal and a small shower of grit, and she held it there, one-handed at shoulder height, while she kicked the runner straight with the toe of her boot. Then she set the door back down, tested it slid now, sullenly, and stepped through into the gray morning, already composing the excuse she would give her teacher. She did not think about the door again. Why would she? It was a door, it had been stuck, she had unstuck it. On a lighter world this would have been a feat that made grown men stare. On Vale's descent it was less than a chore, because a chore is at least worth mentioning, and Priya would no more have mentioned lifting a jammed door than she would have mentioned swallowing. This is the thing the reports never captured, the thing that Vhorruk's medical intelligence had flagged and then filed away. It is not only that the descent-born were strong, it is that they did not know they were strong, in the way a fish does not know it is wet. Strength was not a quality they possessed, it was the medium they lived in. A descent child learned to walk under 3 gravities the way an earth child learned to walk under 1, by falling over and over until the falling stopped. And by the time that child was grown, its body had been quietly rebuilt, bone by denser bone, muscle by deeper anchored muscle, into something that would have made an Olympic strongman weep with envy, and it thought nothing of it at all, because everyone around it could do the same, and a strength that everyone shares is not a strength. It is just the floor. Priya's grandmother, Nadia Anand, had been one of the first-wave colonists, one of the original 6,000 who had ridden the pressure down into the gravity well of a world that most of the galaxy considered uninhabitable and had planted, on its crushing surface, a flag, a farm, and a stubborn refusal to leave. Nadia had buried a husband and two of her own children to the early years, to the heart failures and the bone shears, and the thousand small ways a body from a 1G world could break when you asked it to live in 3. But those who survived had children, and those children had been born into the pull, shaped by it from the first cell, and they did not break. They thrived. And their children, Priya's generation, the third born, were something the galaxy had never seen and had certainly never bothered to look at. A human being who had never once in her life felt heavy, because she had never known anything but weight. That morning, as she trudged toward the low gray school bunker with her satchel on her shoulder, Priya glanced up at the sky, the way everyone on Vale's descent had been glancing up at the sky for 2 days, and she saw the thing that had come to sit above her world. The Keeser dreadnought hung there like a second, malevolent moon. It was so large that it had a visible shape even through the thick, pressure-dense atmosphere, a jagged silhouette bristling with structures whose purpose she could only guess at, and it had brought with it a scatter of smaller ships, and everyone knew, the way a whole population always somehow knows, that something enormous was about to happen, and that the enormous thing had to do with the aliens, and that the aliens thought humans were weak. Priya did not know she was about to become the reason the entire galaxy would have to revise that opinion. She only knew she was late. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. The strap had been digging in, and she walked on toward school, 3 gravities pulling at every step, and she did not feel any of them. The summit was to be held in the colony's largest structure, a domed civic hall called the Vault, which the colonists had built partly for meetings and partly, in the honest way of frontier people, as a shelter of last resort should the world ever decide it had tolerated them long enough. It was a squat and ugly building, engineered against gravity rather than for beauty, its ceiling ribbed with load-bearing arches thick as tree trunks, and into it, on the morning of the first session, filed 2 delegations who could not have understood each other less. The human delegation was led by an administrator named Kessie Okonkwo Vale, the elected steward of Vale's descent, a broad woman in her 60s with the dense build of the descent-born, and a way of standing very still that the Keeser, who valued stillness, would later admit they had misread. Beside her stood a handful of colony officials, and behind them, because the colonists believed in showing their children the shape of history, sat several rows of students from the Civic Academy, brought to observe the proceedings. Priya Anand was in the 3rd row, bored, sketching in the margin of her slate, and wondering how long this would take. The Keeser delegation entered like weather. General Vhorruk Kae came first, and he came without a support frame, exactly as he had promised himself, and the effort of it was the first thing that went wrong with his plan, though he would not have called it an effort. He would have called it a demonstration of will. 2.9 gravities pressed down on him, on a body built for 2.6, and he felt it in every joint and every plate, a deep and grinding heaviness that he wore the way a proud man wears a wound he has decided to ignore. He walked to the center of the hall with slow, deliberate, magnificent steps, and every one of those steps cost him, and he made certain that no one could see the cost, and he believed this is important. He believed that his ability to hide the cost was itself the point. "Look," his stride said. "Look how I stand on your killing world and do not fall. Look at what strength is." The colonists watched him with the polite, faintly puzzled attention of people, watching a man make a great show of something they did all day. Vhorruk did not notice that. He noticed only that they were watching, and he interpreted their attention as awe, because awe was what he had come to collect. He stopped before the administrator. He was more than twice her height. He let the moment stretch, let the whole hall feel the size of him, and then he spoke, and his translator rendered his words into flat, careful human speech that could not carry the contempt in the original, but did not entirely need to. "Administrator, I am General Vhorruk Kae of the Sundering Legions, plenipotentiary of the Keeser Concordance. I have come to your world in my own body, unassisted, so that you might understand from the first moment the nature of the power you are dealing with." He spread his forearms slightly, a gesture that in his species meant here I am, entire. I stand on a world that our own doctrine calls hostile. I stand on it without a frame. I do this so that we may negotiate honestly, from a shared understanding of who is strong and who is not. Administrator Akonkwo looked up at him for a long moment. She had been briefed on Kisur customs. She understood that she was being threatened, and she understood the precise mechanism of the threat, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was not afraid, but she was becoming annoyed. "General," she said, "welcome to Vale's descent. Would you like a chair?" There was a silence. "I do not require a chair," Vhorruk said. "Of course. I only ask because our chairs are reinforced and I wasn't sure yours could take the local gravity. Some of your equipment had trouble at the spaceport." This was true. 2 of the Kisur landing struts had buckled on touchdown, and the story had spread through the colony by lunchtime, and the children in the academy had laughed about it, and Priya had laughed the loudest. "We can bring one over. It's no trouble. We build them to hold a lot." Vhorruk understood that he was being needled, and he understood, further, that the needling was effective precisely because it was so casual, so free of fear, and this bothered him more than open defiance would have. Open defiance he knew how to crush. This was something else. This was a small, dense woman on a crushing world offering him a chair the way one might offer a chair to an elderly relative who ought to sit down before he hurt himself. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," he said, "and proceed to substance." The substance of the summit, over the next several hours, went badly, and it went badly for a reason that neither side fully understood at the time. The Kisur had come to negotiate a withdrawal, humanity's withdrawal, from the contested systems of the Vale Reach, and their entire negotiating posture rested on an unspoken premise, which was that the Kisur could, if pushed, simply take the systems by force, and that everyone in the room knew it, and that the negotiation was therefore merely a formality in which the humans would be permitted to retreat with some dignity intact. But the humans did not seem to know they were supposed to be afraid. They argued. They cited law precedent survey rights, the location of relay stations. They treated the whole thing as a genuine dispute between genuine equals, to be settled on the merits, and every time Vhorruk tried to reintroduce the unspoken premise, the reminder of force, the flexing of the threat, the humans absorbed it with an equanimity that he found increasingly maddening, because it was not the equanimity of the brave, which he could have respected, but the equanimity of people who simply had not been informed that they should be worried. It was the calm of the strong, but they did not present it as strength. They presented it as nothing at all. They presented it as the natural condition of a Tuesday. By the 3rd hour, Vhorruk had begun to suspect, in a place well below his conscious pride, that he had misjudged something. The suspicion did not reach his pride. His pride sealed itself against it, the way a wound seals against infection, and the sealing took the form, as it so often does, of aggression. "I have listened," he said at last, rising, and the whole hall felt the room tilt toward him again, to a great many words about rights. Rights are a fiction that the strong grant to the weak as a kindness and revoke as a convenience. You speak of your claims in the Reach as though they were solid things. They are not. They are permitted things. They exist because we have not yet found it worth our while to end them. He looked around the hall, at the administrator, at the officials, at the rows of students, and his gaze passed over Priya Anand without stopping, because there was nothing in a bored 16-year-old sketching in the margin of a slate to make a general stop. You have built a colony on a heavy world, and you are proud of it, and you have mistaken endurance for power. Let me correct the mistake. Endurance is what the weak call strength when they have run out of other words for it. You have endured this world. We would conquer it. Administrator Akonkwo set down the stylus she had been holding. When she spoke, her voice was still level, still calm, but something had entered it that had not been there before, a kind of tired iron. "General," she said, "may I ask you something, genuinely, not as a negotiating move?" "You may." "How long have you been standing?" Vhorruk paused. "I do not take your meaning." "You came in about 3 hours ago. You refused a chair. You've been standing in 2.9 gravities in a body built for less for 3 hours, and you've been very careful the whole time not to let any of us see that it hurts." She tilted her head. "It does hurt, doesn't it? Your left rear joint's been trembling for the last 20 minutes. I've been watching it. I raised 4 children on this world. I know what a body looks like when it's about to give out and doesn't want anyone to know." The hall was very quiet. "I mention it," Okonkwo went on, "not to shame you, truly. I mention it because you keep using the word strength, and I think you and I mean something very different by it, and I think that difference is going to get a great many people killed if we don't sort it out now. You think strength is standing here for 3 hours through the pain and hiding the pain and calling it will. And that is a kind of strength. I won't take it from you. But to us, General, to the people who live here, standing here for 3 hours isn't strength. It isn't anything. My grandmother did it while carrying a plow. The children behind me did it on the walk to school this morning and thought about it exactly as much as they thought about their own heartbeats." She leaned forward slightly. "You came here to teach us what strength looks like. I'm telling you, as a kindness, that you've been standing in a room full of it for 3 hours and mistaking it for furniture." It was, all things considered, a remarkable speech, and it very nearly worked. Something in it reached the place below Vhorruk's pride where the suspicion lived, and for a single moment, one moment that history would later wish had lasted longer, the general almost heard her, almost let the fact in, almost in the privacy of his own mind said, "What if?" But pride is a muscle too, and his was the strongest in the room, and it clenched. "You threaten me," he said, "with children." "I don't threaten you at all. I'm trying to save your fleet." "You imply that these students, possess some physical capacity that should give me pause." Vhorruk's voice had gone soft and dangerous, and Sethalun at his side felt the deck of his own stomach drop because he had heard that softness before on the eve of 41 conquests. "You imply that a colony of thick-boned peasants, bred down into their gravity well like livestock, has produced something I should fear. Administrator, I have crossed real death worlds. I have buried soldiers whose strength would break every bone in every body in this room. And you offer me your schoolchildren as a warning." He straightened to his full and terrible height, and the pain of it screamed through his frame, and he buried the scream under contempt as he had buried everything under contempt for his entire proud life. "Very well, let us settle it the honest way. Let us settle it the way strength has always been settled since the first world crawled up out of the first sea. Not with words, not with rights, with a trial." "A trial of what?" said Okonkwo, though she already knew, and though a part of her had been steering him toward exactly this cliff for the last hour, and though she was about to feel very sorry for him. "A trial of strength, a public one. Before your people and mine, before the recording eyes of both our fleets, so that there can be no dispute afterward about what was seen." Vhorruk turned slowly, taking in the whole hall, playing to the eyes he knew were watching from orbit, from the unbending, from the Concordance's high command who were reviewing this summit in real time and who needed, he had decided, to be reminded of what a real Keeser general was. "You will select a champion, your strongest. And you will match that champion against a Keeser trial of my choosing. If your champion prevails, I will grant that there is more to your people than my reports contain, and I will negotiate accordingly. And if your champion fails, as your champion will fail, then you will withdraw from the reach, all of you, and you will do it knowing, at last, exactly how weak you are." He expected fear. He expected the humans to blanch, to stall, to refuse, to reveal at last the terror he was certain lay beneath their infuriating calm. Instead, the rows of students began, very quietly, to laugh. It was not cruel laughter, and it was not brave laughter, and that was the thing that unsettled Vhorruk most of all. It was the laughter of children who had just heard an adult propose a contest so lopsided in their own favor that it could only be a joke, and who were too polite to say so out loud, and who were failing, in the manner of children everywhere, to keep the laughter in. A boy in the second row put his hand over his mouth. A girl beside him made a sound like a punctured seal. And in the third row, Priya Anand looked up from her slate for the first time in an hour, blinked at the enormous alien who had just challenged her entire world to a strength contest, and said, to her friend beside her, in a whisper that carried farther in the silent hall than she intended, "Wait, is he serious? A lifting contest against us?" Vhorruk's head turned toward the sound. An administrator Vale, who had spent the last hour trying to save this proud creature's fleet and had failed, closed her eyes for just a moment and made a decision, and when she opened them, she was looking directly at the girl in the third row. "General," she said, "you want a champion. You want our strongest." She almost smiled, and it was not a cruel smile either. It was the smile of someone who has run out of gentler options. "I'm not going to give you our strongest. That wouldn't be fair to you. I'm going to give you an ordinary one, a schoolgirl, 16 years old. Nothing special about her by our measure. She's about average for her year, maybe a little below. If you want to know what our people are, you shouldn't measure yourself against our best. You should measure yourself against our normal." She gestured, and every eye in the hall turned to the third row, and Priya Anand felt her stomach drop into her boots. "Priya, come down here, please." Priya did not want to come down. This is worth stating plainly because the stories that would later be told about her, and there would be many, in 100 languages on 1,000 worlds, tended to skip over it. In the tellings, she was fearless. She strode down from the third row like a hero descending to claim a destiny. That is not what happened. What happened was that a 16-year-old girl who had been minding her own business and sketching a lopsided drawing of her teacher was suddenly the focus of 2 delegations, 400 spectators, an alien general the size of a house, and the recording eyes of 2 fleets. And she wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to sink through the floor and keep sinking until she came out the other side of the world. But you did not, on Vale's descent, refuse the administrator. And more than that, beneath the terror and rising slowly through it, Priya felt something else, something she would have trouble explaining to her grandmother that night, something that had started the moment the huge alien said the words, "As your champion will fail." Because Priya had heard all her short life the same low background hum that every descent child heard, the sense that out there in the wider galaxy of lighter worlds, humans were pitied, weak, soft, barely worth conquering. She had heard it in the tone of every off-world broadcast, in the careful way the Earth Standard traders spoke to the colonists, as though the colonists were a rough and simple frontier folk who had been dealt a bad hand and made the best of it. And now here was the source of the hum itself, a general who had conquered 41 worlds, standing in her civic hall, telling her to her face that she would fail, and something in Priya, some small, dense, gravity-forged thing, stood up inside her before she had consciously decided to stand up at all. She came down the steps. She was small. Next to the general, she looked like a child standing next to a building, because she was a child standing next to a building. She stopped a respectful distance from him and looked up, and up, and up, and she said, because she did not know what else to say, "Hi." Vhorruk Kae looked down at the human girl the way one looks at a mistake. His first, overwhelming reaction was that the administrator had insulted him. He had asked for a champion, for the strongest warrior this heavy world could produce, and they had sent him this. A small soft thing barely past hatchling age, with a satchel still on one shoulder, blinking up at him with the wide eyes of a creature that has just realized it is in over its head. It was an insult so total that it looped around into a kind of tactical gift. He would crush this. He would crush it publicly, gently, without even hurting the child. And in crushing it, he would crush the administrator's whole insufferable performance. and the eyes of the Concordance High Command would see, at last, the truth. That the humans' vaunted heavy world colonists were exactly what his reports had said, thick-boned peasants whose finest specimen was a frightened girl who said hi. "This," Vhorruk said, "is your champion." "She's our normal," said Vale. "I told you, if you beat our normal you'll have proven your point far better than beating our best, and if you don't—" She left it there. "I will not harm the child," Vhorruk said, and he meant it because he was not a cruel creature in the small ways, only in the large ones, the way of empires and doctrines and the convenient filing away of inconvenient reports. "I have no wish to injure a hatchling to make a point. We will choose a trial that carries no risk to her, a trial of pure capacity." He considered. Around the hall the recording eyes of the fleet drank in every second. "A lift. The oldest trial there is. We will find a mass, and each of us will attempt to raise it, and we will see who can and who cannot. There is no trick in it, no skill to hide behind, no distance to fight across. Only the body, and the world's pull upon it and the truth." It was, Vhorruk thought, a perfect trial because a lift is the one contest in which the heavy Keeser body held every advantage. It was also, though he did not know it, the single worst trial he could possibly have chosen, because a lift under 3 gravities against a body forged from birth to move mass under 3 gravities was not a contest at all. It was a category error. He had, in his pride, selected the exact arena in which he was most certain to be humiliated, and he had selected it because he was certain it was the arena in which he could not be. "What mass?" said Vale. Vhorruk looked around the vault for something suitable, something heavy enough to make the point but light enough that he could raise it without the humiliating public strain he had endured all morning. His eye fell on the ceremonial civic anchor stone, a block of dense colonial ferrocrete that stood near the entrance, cast in the first year of the settlement as a monument, engraved with the names of the 6,000 first-wave colonists. It massed. A plaque beside it noted, 480 kilograms. On Earth that would have weighed as much as a small piano. Here, under the pull of Vale's descent, it pressed down with the equivalent weight of nearly 1.5 tons. "That," said Vhorruk, "the stone, we each raise it from the floor to the height of the shoulder, that is all. A simple thing." He looked at Priya with something that was almost, in its way, kind. "I will go first, child, so that you may see the standard you are being asked to meet, and so that no one may say I made you attempt what I would not." He did not go first out of kindness. He went first because he wanted the humans to see it done properly before their girl embarrassed herself, and because, in the small, sealed chamber below his pride where the suspicion still lived, he wanted very badly to establish, for the record and for himself, that the thing could be done at all. Vhorruk approached the anchor stone. He set his 4 feet. He was, whatever else may be said of him, genuinely and formidably strong, one of the strongest warriors of a species bred across 10,000 years of heavy worlds, and he had not risen to command by being weak. He wrapped his 4 great arms around the stone, and he set his spine, and he lifted. The stone came up off the floor. It came up slowly, grinding, and the whole hall watched the enormous alien general strain against nearly 1.5 tons of colonial ferrocrete, and it was, by any honest measure, an extraordinary feat of raw power. On any lighter world it would have been the stuff of legend. Muscles stood out along his arms like cables. His breath came in great bellows gusts through his translator, which rendered them as a rhythmic hiss of static. The stone rose to his knee to his waist, and there it slowed. And there, trembling, streaming with the pale fluid the Keeser sweat under strain, he fought it, inch by inch, toward his shoulder. He did not make it to his shoulder. He got it to the height of his chest, to within a hand's breadth of his shoulder, and there the 2.9 gravities of Vale's descent, the extra pull his body had not been built for, the accumulated fatigue of 3 hours standing, the deep grinding cost he had been hiding all morning, there it all came due at once, and his rear left joint, the one the administrator had watched trembling, buckled. Not fully. He did not fall. But it gave just enough, and the stone dropped from his grip and slammed back to the floor with a boom that shook dust from the ribbed ceiling. And Vhorruk staggered, caught himself on two arms, and stood, chest heaving, having failed to complete the trial he had designed to be unlosable. The hall was silent. It was not a mocking silence. That was the strange thing, the thing Vhorruk would turn over in his mind for a long time afterward. The humans did not laugh at his failure. They watched him with something closer to sympathy, the sympathy of people watching a proud man attempt something they knew was beyond him and refuse, out of pride, to be warned. Even the students who had laughed before were not laughing now. They had seen how hard he tried. On Vale's descent, you did not mock a body that had tried its hardest against the pull and lost. Everyone there had a grandparent in the burial fields who had lost that same fight. Vhorruk straightened slowly. His pride, magnificent and terrible, refused to acknowledge what his body had just told the entire galaxy. "The stone," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended, "is heavier than I estimated. It is a fair mass, a worthy trial. It is, and here, if he had been a wiser being, he would have stopped, would have declared the mass too great for anyone present, would have found a graceful exit. But he was not a wiser being. He was a proud one, and his pride, having been wounded, did the thing that wounded pride always does. It reached for someone smaller to feel large against. It is a mass that will defeat your champion utterly. Come, child, attempt it. Let us end this." And Priya Anand, who had watched the whole thing with a slowly dawning expression that was not fear at all, stepped up to the anchor stone. She had passed this stone every single day of her life. It stood at the entrance of the vault, and her own grandmother's name was carved on it, Nadiaanand, third line from the top, first wave colonist, and Priya had, as a small child, been lifted up to trace the letters with her finger, and she had, as a slightly larger child, helped move this very stone during a floor renovation 2 years earlier, when the civic crew had needed to shift it 4 meters to lay new plating. And they had asked the Academy's senior students to help, because it was easier than bringing a lifter in. And Priya and 3 of her classmates had picked it up and carried it, and set it back down and gone to lunch. She did not say any of this. She was 16, and she was frightened, and she was also, underneath the fear, quietly and completely certain, in the way you are certain of the ground. She looked up at the general one more time. "Just to my shoulder," she asked. "That's the whole thing." "That is the whole thing," said Vhorruk, and there was, for the last time, contempt in it. "Do not injure yourself, child. There is no shame in setting it down. No one expects." Priya bent, and got her hands under the anchor stone and stood up. The stone came off the floor as though it had been waiting to. It came up clean in one smooth, unbroken motion, past her knees, past her waist, and she shifted her grip once halfway, the way you shift your grip on any heavy thing, and she brought it up to her shoulder and past her shoulder. And then, because some small defiant part of her had decided that to my shoulder was not going to be enough, not after, as your champion will fail, not after a lifetime of the low pitying hum, she kept going, and she pressed the 480-kilogram anchor stone. The stone that had defeated General Vhorruk Kae, the stone that weighed nearly 1.5 tons on her crushing world, straight up over her head, arms locked, at the full extension of her small, dense 16-year-old body, and held it there. The names of the 6,000 first-wave colonists faced the ceiling. Her grandmother's name was among them. Priya stood beneath them all, holding them up, and looked at the general. "Is this right?" she asked. "Am I doing it right?" Nobody in the hall moved. Nobody in the 2 fleets, watching through the recording eyes, moved either, though Priya could not know that. On the bridge of the Unbending, a Concordance intelligence officer 300,000 kilometers away leaned very slowly toward his screen and said a word that his translator declined to render. Vhorruk Kae stared at the girl holding over her head the mass he had failed to raise to his shoulder, and for the first time in 41 conquests, in a life built stone by stone on the certainty that strength was a thing he had bled for, and puddle creatures could not have. General Vhorruk Kae did not know what to say. Priya held the stone overhead for a moment longer, and then, because her arms were beginning to notice they were doing something, and because holding a monument over your head in front of 400 people is deeply embarrassing when the initial rush of defiance wears off, she lowered it, controlled, back down to her chest, and then to her waist, and then set it gently on the floor exactly where it had stood for 2 generations, without so much as a scuff on the plating. She stepped back and wiped her hands on her school trousers and looked at the general with an expression that had drained of defiance and refilled with something much more dangerous to his worldview: apology. "Sorry," she said. I didn't mean to show off with the overhead part. I kind of got carried away. The shoulder thing would have been fine. It's not that heavy." "It's not that heavy." Those 4 words did more damage to General Vhorruk Kae than any weapon in his fleet could have done, and the girl who spoke them had no idea because she meant them. She was not gloating. She was not making a point. She was a polite 16-year-old apologizing for having overdone a task, the way you might apologize for laughing too hard at a joke that turned out to be at someone's expense. "It's not that heavy." She had lifted the stone that broke him, pressed it over her head, and her honest assessment of the experience was a mild "it's not that heavy," delivered with a wince of social embarrassment. The Keeser have a concept they call thulverk, which translates poorly but means, roughly, the moment when a fact you have refused enters the room anyway and sits down and will not leave. Vhorruk was experiencing thulverk. He had refused the fact on the observation deck of the Unbending. He had refused it when Sethalun told him the gravity index. He had refused it through 3 hours of an increasingly unnerving summit. He had rebuilt the fact, over and over, into shapes he could tolerate: compensation, not strength; a crutch, not a leg; peasants, not warriors; and now the fact had walked down from the 3rd row in the form of a girl with a satchel and had lifted, over her head without strain, the weight that his own bled-for, doctrine-forged 41 worlds body could not raise to its shoulder, and there was no shape left to rebuild it into. The fact simply sat there. "It's not that heavy." Vhorruk said, and stopped. He tried again. "That stone masses 480 kilograms. "Yeah," said Priya. "We moved it during the floor works 2 years ago, me and Deshen and the twins. It took the 4 of us because it's awkward to hold, not because one of us could have done it. It's just easier with 4 so you don't drop it on your feet." She frowned, worried she was being rude. "Do you want to try again? Maybe with a lighter one? We could find you something that isn't the monument. That was probably a bad choice. My administrator shouldn't have let you pick the monument. It's really dense." Sethalun, standing at the general's side, had gone entirely still, and inside that stillness his whole understanding of the coming war was rearranging itself with the speed of a landslide. He had helped write the assessments. He had helped deprioritize the flag. He had sat in the strategy chambers where senior planners had drawn arrows across the Veil Reach, and described, in confident tones, how the Concordance's heavy world infantry would sweep the soft humans from every contested system in a single campaign season. And now he stood in a civic hall on a world his own doctrine called too hostile for ground operations, watching that world's below-average schoolchildren offer his general a handicap. And he understood, with the cold clarity that comes to intelligence officers exactly once or twice in a career, and usually too late, that every one of those confident arrows had been drawn on a map of a war that did not exist. Because it was not only the girl. That was the thing Sethalun grasped in that moment, the thing that would fill his report and be ignored by the same institution that had ignored the first flag. It was not one exceptional child. Priya Anand was, by her own colony's honest measure, average. A little below average, the administrator had said, and the administrator had not been lying, and the students in the rows behind her were nodding along because they knew Priya. They knew her marks and her times and where she placed in the academy's physical assessments, and she placed in the middle, and the middle of Vale's descent could press over its head the weight that broke a Keeser general. There were 40,000 colonists on Vale's descent. There were, Sethalun's mind supplied, unbidden and merciless, 3 other high-gravity human colonies in the surveyed spheres, and an unknown number beyond them, and behind all of them the homeworld itself, the one the humans called a Deathworld, the one the Keeser had laughed at, 1G, a puddle, and Sethalun understood in a rush of vertigo that the Keeser had never once asked why a species would call a 1G world a Deathworld. Had never wondered what kind of creature looks at a gentle planet and files it under Category 9, because to a human, apparently, 1G was where the easy part was. 1G was the vacation. 1G was the world you retreated to when the real worlds got to be too much. And the Keeser had spent 8 years preparing to invade a people for whom pain and pressure and crushing weight were not a battlefield to be survived, but a childhood to be outgrown. We did not adapt to our worlds, the general had said on the observation deck a lifetime ago. We conquered them. And the humans, Sethalun now understood, had done neither. The humans had simply moved in. General, Sethalun said, very quietly, in the private Keeser register that the human translators would not catch. We should conclude the summit. Vhorruk did not answer him. Vhorruk was still looking at the girl, and something was happening in the general that had not happened in a very long time, something that his pride was fighting with everything it had, and losing. Because the girl was still talking, she was still, in her earnest and mortified 16-year-old way, trying to make him feel better about it. I really think it was the monument that got you, Priya was saying. It's not a fair test piece. It's cast solid and it's got the reinforcement bar through the middle. My grandmother told me they overbuilt it on purpose so it'd last, so it's way denser than it looks. You did really well to get it off the floor at all, honestly. Most off-world stuff can't even. She caught herself, flushed. Sorry, I don't mean off-worlders are weak. I just mean it's a big rock. Child, said Vhorruk, his voice had changed. The contempt was gone from it, not because his pride had surrendered. His pride would take much longer to surrender, and part of it never would, but because contempt requires a certain confidence in one's own frame of reference, and Vhorruk's frame of reference had just been lifted over a schoolgirl's head and set down without a scuff. How much can you lift? Priya blinked. I don't know, I've never really measured, why would I? And this too was devastating because it was true. Why would she? On Vale's descent, your lifting capacity was not a number you tracked, any more than an Earth-child tracks how far it can see or how loudly it can shout. It was just the shape of the possible. More than that, I guess. The stone wasn't I had more. I could feel I had more. But we don't really, max out on stuff. Grandmother says the people who tried to max out are the ones in the burial fields. You learn to work well within yourself here. The world doesn't forgive showing off. She glanced guiltily at the anchor stone, which I just did, sorry again. Outside the vault, though none in the hall yet knew it, the recording of the trial had already left the building. It had gone up to the 2 fleets in real time, and from the fleets it had begun, in the way these things always begin, to leak, to spread ship to ship, then to the relay stations, then out along the great branching arteries of galactic communication. And within a single local day, the image of a small human girl pressing over her head the stone that had defeated General Vhorruk Kae of the Sundering Legions would be the single most viewed recording in the surveyed galaxy, and it would carry with it, translated into 400 tongues, the 4 words that ended a war before it began. It's not that heavy. Vhorruk turned at last, away from the girl. He looked at Administrator Okonkwo Vale, who had watched the whole thing with her arms folded and her face grave, taking no pleasure in it, because she had tried to warn him, and she was not the sort of person who enjoyed being right about a thing this large. You knew, he said. You steered me to this, to the lift. You let me choose the trial, but you knew that any trial of strength would end this way, and you let me walk into it in front of my own high command because you wanted them to see it, not me, them. He was, whatever his other failings, a strategist, and he saw the shape of it now. You did not do this to humiliate me, Administrator. You did this so that no war would be necessary. You did this to save lives, mine included. Yes, said Okonkwo simply, I did. I tried words first, General, for 3 hours. You wouldn't take words. Your people never do. That's not an insult, it's just true. Your whole doctrine is built on the idea that words are what the weak use when they've run out of strength. So I gave you the only argument your doctrine could hear. I let you measure us. I'm sorry it had to be a child who did the measuring, but you'd never have believed an adult. You'd have said we picked our strongest, or cheated, or that it was a trick. So I gave you our normal, and I gave you the honest number, and I let you pick the game. She unfolded her arms. I didn't want a war I knew we'd win, General. Winning that war would have meant burying a lot of these children. So I spent one afternoon of one girl's embarrassment to buy all their lives. I'd do it again. I'd do it 1,000 times. Vhorruk was silent for a long moment. Then he looked back at Priya one more time, and the girl, not knowing what else to do with the enormous, defeated, unreadable alien staring at her, gave him a small, awkward, entirely human wave. And General Vhorruk Kae, conqueror of 41 worlds, plenipotentiary of the Sundering Legions, who had come to this heavy little world to teach its peasants what strength looked like, did a thing that would be remembered longer than any of his conquests. In front of both delegations, in front of the recording eyes of both fleets, in front of the high command that had sent him here to make an example of the humans, he lowered his great armored head to the 16-year-old girl in the school uniform, in the ancient Kisur gesture of one warrior acknowledging a strength greater than his own, and he held it there, and the whole galaxy watched him do it. You are not what my reports contain, child, he said, nor is your world, nor I begin to fear is your species. He straightened. I withdraw the trial, I withdraw the threat behind it. And I will carry back to my high command a report that no one there will wish to hear, and I will make them hear it anyway, because I have stood on your world in my own body, and it has taught me the lesson I came here to teach, and it did not spare me the way you spared me. He almost smiled in the terrible Kisur way. It's not that heavy, you said, child. I have carried the weight of that sentence since you spoke it, and I will carry it the rest of my life, and it is heavier than any stone in your vault. That should have been the end of it. In a wiser galaxy it would have been. A general had been humbled, a truth had been established, a war had been averted, and a girl had gone home to her grandmother to be told off gently for showing off with the overhead press. The recording had spread, the concordance had seen, the lesson had apparently landed. But an institution is not a general, and the thing that makes an institution dangerous is precisely that it cannot lower its head. General Vhorruk Kae could bow to a schoolgirl in a civic hall because Vhorruk was a person, and a person can be surprised, and a surprised person can change. The Concordance High Command was not a person. It was a doctrine wearing 1,000 uniforms, and a doctrine does not experience Thulverk. When the recording of the trial reached the strategy chambers, the doctrine did not lower its head. The doctrine did what doctrines do when confronted with a fact that unmakes them. It looked for a way to make the fact go away. The way it found was a Kisur field marshal named Oskith Vrown. Field Marshal Vrown outranked Vhorruk, and Field Marshal Vrown had watched the recording of the trial with mounting fury, not at the humans but at Vhorruk, whom he regarded as a sentimentalist who had allowed himself to be theatrically deceived. Vrown's analysis of the trial was simple and, to a certain kind of mind, unassailable. The humans had rigged it. The stone was hollow, or gimmicked, or the girl was a genetic ringer they had passed off as ordinary, or the whole thing was a staged psychological operation designed to make the concordance flinch. Strength did not work the way the recording claimed. Strength was bred through hardship and blood and doctrine. It was not something a puddle species handed out to its schoolchildren. Vrown knew this the way Vhorruk had once known it, with the total, sealed, unarguable certainty of a being whose entire life was an investment in its being true. And so, 3 days after the summit, without consulting Vhorruk, Field Marshal Vhroun brought his own detachment down to Vale's descent to conduct what he called a proper assessment. He brought soldiers. He brought engineers with scanning equipment to prove the anchor stone was gimmicked. And because Field Marshal Vhroun believed in making a point the way a hammer believes in making a point, he brought a battle walker. The Keeser called it a threshold-class assault vehicle. The humans, when they saw it, called it a tank, because it was easier and because that is what it was. A Keeser main battle unit, a low, broad armored fortress the size of a small house, running on 8 articulated legs rather than treads, mounting a spinal cannon that could reduce the vault to slag in a single discharge. It massed, fully loaded, 40 tons. On Vale's descent, under 3 gravities, it pressed down on its 8 great feet with the weight of 120 tons, and even the Keeser engineers had reinforced its leg servos for the deployment, because the local gravity was, by their own doctrine, hostile. Field Marshal Vhroun brought the tank down into the colony's central plaza, in front of the vault, in front of the assembled colonists whom his soldiers had summoned there, and he brought it for a simple reason. He was going to expose the fraud. He was going to demand that the girl repeat her feat, and when she failed, as she would fail, because the anchor stone had obviously been rigged, he would establish, on the record before both fleets, that the humans were exactly what the doctrine said they were, and the inconvenient recording would be revealed as the psychological operation he knew it to be, and the war plans could proceed. He had, in other words, made exactly Vhorruk's mistake, but larger and with a tank. Priya was in the plaza because everyone was in the plaza. The soldiers had summoned the colony, and the colony had come. 40,000 dense and quiet people who had lived their whole lives under a weight that would kill the beings now pointing weapons at them, and who were, the Keeser soldiers slowly began to notice, not afraid. That was the thing the soldiers reported to Vhroun in low, uneasy voices. The humans were not afraid. They were annoyed. They stood in the crushing plaza in their work clothes, holding their heavy tools, having been pulled away from their farms and their fabricators, and they looked at the tank and the soldiers with the flat irritation of people whose afternoon has been interrupted by someone who does not understand the neighborhood. Vhorruk arrived at a run, as much as a Keeser could run, under 3 gravities in a body already half broken by his previous visit, because Sethalun had warned him what Vhroun intended, and Vhorruk had understood with dread exactly how this would go. He arrived to find Field Marshal Vhroun standing atop the battle walker, addressing the colonists through amplifiers, demanding the girl. "Bring me the child from the recording," Vhroun's translator boomed across the plaza. "The one who claims to have lifted your monument. Bring her and let her attempt a real weight, an honest weight under honest observation, so that this galaxy may see the truth of what you are. Your monument was a trick. Your recording was a lie. I have come to prove it. Bring me the girl." "Oskith," said Vhorruk, forcing his way to the front, his voice ragged. "Stand down. You do not understand what you are." "I understand that you were deceived, Kae," said Vhroun without looking down at him. "By theater, by a soft-world psychological operation. I am here to undo the damage your sentimentality has done to our doctrine. Where is the girl?" And Priya Anand, standing in the crowd between her grandmother and her friend Deshin, felt the entire colony's attention shift toward her for the second time in 3 days, and felt her stomach drop for the second time in 3 days. And this time there was no administrator to send her down the steps. This time there was only a tank, and a field marshal, and 40,000 of her neighbors, and a challenge that had crossed the line from insult into threat, because Vhroun's soldiers had their weapons out, and a threat aimed at your neighbors is a different thing entirely from a threat aimed at your pride. She stepped out of the crowd. "I'm the girl," she said. Her voice shook, and she let it shake because she was 16 and there was a cannon pointed at her town, and pretending not to be scared would have been a lie, and Priya Anand did not lie. "I lifted the monument. It wasn't a trick. It's just a rock. You can scan it. Your people are already scanning it. I can see them over there, and they're not saying anything, which means they already know it's solid, and you're going to ignore them the same way the last one ignored his reports. She had learned that in the last 3 days from Administrator Vale, who had explained to her over dinner exactly what had gone wrong in the general's mind and why. You already know it's true. You just don't want it to be. So what do you actually want? Because it's not the truth. You've got the truth. You want me to fail so you can unknow it. There was a low sound from the crowd. It was the sound of 40,000 people recognizing that a 16-year-old had just said the thing out loud and agreeing with it. Field Marshal Vhorruk looked down at the small human girl from atop his battle walker, and his fury curdled into something colder. "Very well," he said. "You wish to speak of what I want. I will tell you what I want, child. I want you to lift something that cannot be gimmicked, something that no colony could hollow out or reinforce or replace with a lighter double." He struck the hull of the battle walker beside him with one great fist, a booming metallic clang that rolled across the plaza. "This. My command unit. 40 tons of concordance battle steel, which in your world's gravity weighs as much as a small building. You claim the strength of your people is honest and ordinary and freely shared. Then lift it. Lift my tank, girl, with your own 2 hands, and I will believe every word of your recording, or admit that it was a lie and let this galaxy return to its senses." He folded his 4 arms. "I will even permit you to decline. There is no shame in a child declining to lift a battle walker. It is the only sane response." It was meant to be impossible. That was the entire point. Vhorruk had chosen 40 tons precisely because it was so far beyond the anchor stone's 480 kilograms, nearly 85 times the mass, that no amount of heavy world adaptation could possibly bridge the gap. He had chosen a weight that would expose the fraud not by a little but by an ocean, a weight against which the girl would strain and fail and be revealed, and the recording with her. He had made one last time the doctrine's fundamental error. He had reasoned about human strength from the outside, from the numbers, from the assessments, and he had never once stood inside a descent-born body and felt what the world felt like from there. He did not know that the anchor stone had not been Priya's limit. She had told the general so 3 days ago in her honest, bewildered way. I had more. I could feel I had more. He did not know that a 40-ton battle walker, resting on 8 widespread legs, did not present 40 tons to any single lifting point, because its mass was distributed, and that lifting one end of it, tipping it, breaking one set of legs off the ground and levering it up, asked far less of a body than the raw mass number implied. He did not know any of the things that a colony of heavy world engineers and heavy world children knew in their bones about how weight actually moved. And most of all, Field Marshal Vhorruk did not know the thing that Administrator Vale had known, the thing that made her fold her arms now and go very quiet at the edge of the plaza, the thing that made Vhorruk close his eyes in something between dread and awe. He did not know that he had just done, in front of 40,000 colonists in both fleets and the whole watching galaxy, the one thing you must never do to a descent-born. He had threatened her town, and then he had told her the weight was too heavy to lift. Priya Anand looked at the battle walker for a long time. She was not in that moment thinking about the galaxy watching, or the recording, or the doctrine, or the field marshal's cold contempt. Those things were too large to think about, so she set them down, the way you set down a load that is too awkward to hold and pick up piece by piece. She thought instead about the machine in front of her, because the machine was a thing you could actually understand, and understanding the thing in front of you is the only strength that has ever really mattered. She walked toward the tank. Vhorruk's soldiers tensed. Vhorruk raised one hand to still them because he wanted this. He wanted her close. He wanted the crowd to see her small and futile against the great armored bulk. Priya walked past the wide-planted forelegs and put one hand flat against the cold battle steel of the hull, and she looked at how the 8 legs were set, and how the mass sat over them, and how the whole machine balanced, and her grandmother watched her do it and knew exactly what she was doing, because it was what you were taught on Vale's descent before you were ever allowed near a real load. Look at the thing. Find where it wants to move. Never fight a weight. Ask it where it's already trying to go and help it there. You want me to lift it, Priya said, not a question. She was working now and her voice had steadied because the fear had somewhere to go, into the task. Off the ground. All of it or just enough to prove it's real. All pretense aside, said Vhrown from atop the machine, lift it clear of the ground with your own strength and I will concede. Any part of it still touching the ground and you have failed. Those are the terms. Do you accept them or do you decline? I accept, said Priya. She did not go for the middle. That was the first thing the watching Kisur engineers noticed, and the thing they could not stop themselves from murmuring about, because it was so obviously correct and so far from what any of them would have expected a panicking child to do. She did not try to lift 40 tons at its center of mass. She walked to the rear of the battle walker, to the point behind the last pair of legs where the hull swept up into the housing of the spinal cannon, and she got both hands under the trailing edge of the hull, and she set her feet in the reinforced plaza plating, her people's plating, poured to hold her people's weight, and she settled her hips and dropped her center low, the way she had been taught, the way 40,000 of her neighbors had been taught, the way you settle before you ask a heavy thing to move. She's going to tip it, said Sethalun very quietly in wonder. She's not lifting the mass, she's rotating it. She's going to break the front legs off the ground by driving the back up, and lever the whole thing over its own hind feet. And then it will all be off the ground at the top of the arc, said Vhorruk, who had opened his eyes and who was watching now with an expression that no one who had known him for 41 conquests would have recognized. For one instant, all 8 legs, clear. He drew a slow breath. Oskith, Oskith, you fool, stop this. Come down from there, come down now. But Field Marshal Vhrown did not come down, because Field Marshal Vhrown still, even now, could not believe. That was the last gift the doctrine gave him, the perfect, seamless inability to believe the thing his own eyes were about to show him. He stood atop the battle walker with his 4 arms folded and a sneer on his plated face, and he waited for the girl to strain and fail. And he did not understand that he was standing on top of the exact object that was about to become the most famous lifted weight in galactic history, and that he was going to be standing on it when it went up. Priya breathed out. And then, without any drama at all, that was the thing the recordings caught, the thing that made the moment travel across 400 worlds and never stop traveling, without a scream or a roar or a heroic bellow. With nothing but the quiet total commitment of a body doing what it had been built and shaped and forged from birth to do, Priya Anand lifted. She drove up through her legs first, through the deep dense muscle that 3 gravities had layered onto her small frame across 16 years, and the drive went up through her hips and her locked spine and out through her arms, and into the trailing edge of 40 tons of Kisur battle steel, and the rear of the battle walker came up. It came up slowly, because 40 tons has inertia even when you're only tipping it, and for one heartbeat nothing seemed to happen at all, and Field Marshal Vhrown's sneer began, ever so slightly, to widen into triumph. And then the machine's rear rose past the point of resistance, past the balance, and the great weight of it began to rotate forward over its own hind legs exactly as Sethalun had predicted, and the 4 legs lifted from the plaza, one pair and then the other, and the crowd of 40,000 made a single vast indrawn sound, and Field Marshal Vhrown's triumph froze on his face, and shattered as the deck of his own command unit tilted beneath his feet and rose into the sky. Priya kept driving. She walked her hands up the hull as it rotated, keeping under the load, keeping it moving where it wanted to go, and she brought the whole rear of the machine up over her head, and at the top of the arc the great battle walker balanced on the very tips of its rearmost feet, tipped so far forward that for one full second, one clean, undeniable, galaxy-changing second, every one of its 8 legs left the ground at once. All 40 tons of it held aloft on the arc of a 16-year-old girl's lift, and Field Marshal Oscath Vrown of the Keeser Concordance clung to the top of his own weapon with all four arms as it hung in the crushing sky of a human Deathworld. Entirely airborne, entirely lifted, entirely, publicly, undeniably held up by a schoolgirl. She held it there. She held 40 tons of battle steel and a screaming field marshal at the top of its arc, her arms locked, her feet planted in her people's plating, her grandmother's name carved on a stone 30 meters away, and she was not straining. That was the detail that traveled farthest, that no amount of concordance denial could ever explain away. At the top of the lift, holding a battle walker over her head, Priya Anand was not straining. She was concentrating. There is a difference, and every being in the galaxy who watched the recording understood the difference instantly and in their bones, and the difference was the end of the war. Then, because she had proven the thing, and because a descent-born never holds a weight 1 second longer than the task requires, the world does not forgive showing off, her grandmother said, and Priya had learned the lesson even if she'd bent it once with the anchor stone. She brought the battle walker back down. She did not drop it. She reversed the arc, controlled, easing 40 tons and one field marshal back down through the sky, and she set the forelegs onto the plaza as gently as she had set the anchor stone back on its plating, without a jolt, without a scuff, and she stepped back and let go, and the machine settled onto its 8 feet with a soft hydraulic sigh, upright, undamaged, and Field Marshal Oscath Vrown stood atop it, alive, unhurt, and finished. The plaza was utterly silent. Priya wiped her hands on her trousers. She looked up at the field marshal, who was staring down at her with an expression that had passed all the way through fury and terror, and out the far side into the blank, hollow astonishment of a being whose entire universe has just been lifted over a child's head and set back down without permission. "Sorry about the shaking at the top," Priya said into the silence, because she was 16 and mortified, and it was the only thing she could think to say. "I don't usually do it that high. You were kind of in the way, so I couldn't just tip it and drop it. I had to hold the balance longer so you wouldn't fall off." She frowned, genuinely worried. "Are you okay? You're holding on really tight. You can come down now." "It's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere." Later, the historians of 4 species would argue about which sentence had ended the war. Some said it was the administrator's "it's not that heavy in the vault." Some said it was Vhorruk's confession that the sentence weighed more than any stone. But most, in the end, came back to those 5 ordinary words spoken by a mortified girl to a broken field marshal atop the tank she had just held in the sky. "You can come down now. It's not going anywhere." Because that was the sentence that made it undeniable that she had not been trying to win. She had been trying to be helpful. She had held a battle walker aloft with the same care she would have used to hold a door for a stranger, and she had set it down gently so its rider wouldn't be hurt. And now she was concerned about his grip, and there was no framework in the entire architecture of the Keeser doctrine of strength that could survive being pitied by the very weakling it had come to expose. Field Marshal Vrown did not answer her. He climbed down from the battle walker in silence, his 4 arms trembling, and when his feet touched the plaza he did not look at the girl or at the crowd or at the recording eyes. He looked at Vhorruk, and Vhorruk looked back at him, and something passed between the 2 old warriors that needed no translator, and it was this: "Now you know. Now you have felt it too. Now the fact has come into your room and sat down, and it will never leave, and you will spend the rest of your life carrying it, as I carry it, as our whole people will now have to carry it, because it has been shown to the entire galaxy, and it cannot be unshown." Vhorruk turned to Administrator Okonkwo Vale, who had come to stand beside her people, and who was looking at Priya with a fierce and private pride that she was trying, without much success, to keep off her face. "There will be no invasion of the Vale Reach," Vhorruk said. His voice carried across the silent plaza, and he made certain it did, because he knew the recording eyes were on him, and this time he wanted the high command to hear every word. "There will be no invasion of your colonies, or your homeworld, or any world your people have chosen to endure. I will carry this recording to the concordance myself, and I will stand before the full council, and I will tell them what I have twice now seen with my own eyes, that we spent 8 years preparing to conquer a species for whom our killing worlds are a mild afternoon, and that we escaped that error not because we were wise but because a child on a heavy world was kind enough to lift our tank instead of throwing it. He paused. They will not want to hear it. I did not want to hear it. But it is heavier than any of us, and it will not be set down. He turned one last time to Priya. And General Vhorruk Kae, conqueror of 41 worlds, lowered his great head to the 16-year-old girl for the second time in 3 days. But this time Field Marshal Vhrown lowered his head beside him. And then, one by one, in a slow spreading ripple across the plaza, every Keeser soldier in the detachment lowered theirs too. 40 warriors of the Sundering Legions bowing to a schoolgirl in a work-stained uniform who had never once in her life thought of herself as strong. Priya, overwhelmed, did the only thing she could think of. She gave them a small, awkward wave, the same wave she had given the general in the vault, and she said, "You're welcome." "I guess." And somewhere in the crowd her friend Desson snorted, and then someone else laughed. And then the whole plaza of 40,000 heavy world colonists was laughing, warmly, the tension breaking all at once, and even a few of the Keeser made the clicking sound that was as close as they came to laughter. And the war that had been 8 years in the making ended not with a shot, but with a girl saying "You're welcome, I guess," to an army that had come to conquer her and had stayed to bow. That evening, Priya Anand walked home under the 3 gravities of the only world she had ever known, her satchel on one shoulder, past the burial fields where the first wave colonists slept, the ones who had broken so that she could be built. She was tired and embarrassed and secretly, quietly proud, and she was already dreading how much everyone at the academy was going to talk about it tomorrow. She reached her house, and the door, the same door, the heavy composite slab that had jammed on its runner 3 days and a lifetime ago, stuck again as she tried to open it. Priya sighed. She hooked 2 fingers under the edge, set her feet, and lifted it clear of its bent runner, held 300 kilograms one-handed at shoulder height while she kicked the runner straight, and set it down, and it slid. She did not think about it. Why would she? It was a door, it had been stuck. She had unstuck it. Above her, in the pressure-dense sky, the great dreadnought Unbending was already climbing out of orbit, carrying home a general and a field marshal, and a recording that would rearrange the balance of the galaxy. And none of it seemed, to Priya Anand, remotely as important as the fact that she was late for dinner, and her grandmother was going to have opinions about the whole tank business. She went inside. Behind her, the galaxy quietly rewrote everything it thought it knew about strength, about weakness, about the soft, wet creatures from the puddle world who called their gentle planet a Deathworld, and had never, not once, been asked what they meant by the word, and who had answered at last, without meaning to, without even trying, with a shrug and a wave and 5 ordinary words spoken to a defeated army in a crushing plaza. "It's not that heavy."